There is a kind of courage that does not arrive with fanfare or certainty. It comes quietly, the way morning light does, slowly filling the corners of a room you were sure would stay dark forever. Most people who have lived past 50 know exactly what that feels like. They've felt it in their own chests, in the moment before saying yes to something that frightened them, in the pause before picking up the phone to call someone they'd missed for far too long. This is a story about that kind of courage. It begins, as so many unexpected things do, with a Thursday evening in October and a restaurant reservation for two. Her name was Caroline Whitfield. She was 51, though people said she carried herself like a woman who had simply decided age was a rumor she didn't intend to believe. She was CEO of Whitfield Partners, a real estate development firm she'd built from the bones of her late father's small property business in Cincinnati. It had taken 23 years, early mornings and late nights, learning to read a room full of men who didn't expect a woman to know more than they did, and proving, gently but absolutely, that she did. Caroline hadn't been on a date in 4 years. Not for lack of interest, she wanted companionship, deeply, and sometimes lay awake listening to the city outside her window, feeling the particular ache of having built a full life that still had an empty chair in it. But her last relationship had ended in a way that made her cautious, not bitter exactly, just careful. The way you're careful after burning your hand on a stove you didn't think was still hot. Her friend Margaret had arranged this evening. Margaret, her college roommate, still believed after all these decades that the universe had a plan and that Caroline's job was simply to show up and let it unfold. The restaurant was Harlow's, on the 14th floor of a downtown building, floor-to-ceiling glass, white linen, a piano playing something from another era. The kind of place that made the world outside feel very far away. Caroline arrived at 6:45, wearing a deep navy dress with small blue flowers along the neckline, worn once before, to a charity gala 2 years ago. She'd nearly not worn it tonight, standing in front of her mirror for 20 minutes, holding it up against a simpler black dress, before finally putting it on and leaving before she could change her mind again. The maitre d' showed her to a table by the window. She looked out at the glittering city and thought, quietly, whatever happens, you are here. You came. That is already something. His name was Daniel Merritt. 54. A structural engineer who'd spent the last decade running his own firm after leaving the large corporate practice where he'd made his name. He wasn't wealthy the way Caroline was, but he was comfortable, and more importantly, his comfort came from knowing exactly who he was and not apologizing for it. He had 3 sons. Owen, 11, was the serious one, a reader, a boy who asked questions at dinner that made Daniel put down his fork and think for a full minute before answering. He had his mother's eyes, his father's stubborn streak, and a gift for seeing the inside of things, as though he'd arrived in the world with more than the usual amount of perception. Marcus, 8, was bright and fizzy and always in motion, the kind of child who turned any room into something more just by entering it. He made friends in grocery store lines, on airplanes, with every dog he'd ever passed on every sidewalk in the city. And then there was Cooper. 3 years old, his father's dark curly hair, an expression of absolute seriousness that people found both funny and endearing. He was at the age where the world sometimes became too large, and he'd simply lift his arms toward Daniel without a word, the universal language of a small child who has decided that being held is the only reasonable solution to the current situation. Their mother, Ellen, had died 2.5 years earlier, a sudden illness. The kind that arrives without warning and leaves before you've had any chance to reason with it. The boys had been 5, 3, and barely 1. Daniel had spent the first year after in a kind of fog he still had trouble describing. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, more like learning to live in a house that had been rearranged in the dark. Everything was still there, but nothing was quite where he expected it. He'd raised his sons with tenderness and steadiness, and they'd grown the way children grow when they're truly loved, with roots deep enough to hold them when the wind came. Margaret had known Daniel through her husband, Thomas, who'd worked with him on a city project 3 years back. She'd called Daniel on a Tuesday and said, simply, "I want you to meet someone. She's wonderful. Just say yes." He'd said yes, partly because Thomas swore by Margaret's judgment, and partly because Owen, with the directness of an 11-year-old who'd inherited too much of his father's honesty, had told him it was all right to have dinner with someone. That it didn't have to mean anything except dinner. The complication Daniel hadn't planned for was childcare. His regular sitter, Mrs. Bauer, a retired schoolteacher on the 3rd floor of his building, who adored the boys and was adored right back, called that afternoon with a head cold and an apology. Daniel spent an hour on the phone and in texts trying to arrange alternatives. None of them worked. His sister was in Boston. His neighbor was at a concert. The backup sitter he'd used twice before was at a family dinner. At 5:15, Daniel stood in the kitchen looking at 3 small faces looking back at him with complete faith. He thought about canceling. Then Owen said, "Dad, just take us." Caroline saw them before they saw her. She'd been watching the entrance out of habit, the way people do while waiting for someone they've never met, running through some internal inventory of what to expect. Then the door opened, and a man walked in carrying a small, dark-haired boy on his hip, 2 other boys close behind. Something shifted in her chest that she couldn't quite name. He was tall and broad-shouldered in a well-cut navy suit, white shirt open at the collar, the kind of face that looked better the longer you looked at it. He scanned the room with an expression she recognized immediately, because she'd worn it herself 20 minutes earlier, someone trying very hard to appear calmer than they felt. Then he spotted her. For a moment neither of them moved. Then he crossed the room toward her table, his jaw set the way a person's jaw sets when they've made a decision and intend to stand by it. The smallest boy watched her with enormous, serious eyes. The middle boy was already smiling the smile of a child who'd decided, before he even arrived, that this was going to be a good evening. Daniel stopped beside the table. "Caroline. I am so sorry. I know this isn't what either of us was expecting. My sitter canceled, and I should have called. If you want to reschedule, I completely understand. I'm genuinely embarrassed, but..." "Sit down," Caroline said. Her voice was quiet, warm, entirely steady. The same voice she used in boardrooms when she wanted people to stop worrying and start thinking clearly. Daniel blinked. "Please," she added. "All of you." What happened over the next 3 hours was not what either of them had planned. It was better. The maitre d', a man named Gerald who'd worked at Harlow's for 19 years and seen a great many things in that dining room, handled it all with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that grace is mostly a matter of good preparation and good instincts. 3 booster seats appeared. A children's menu appeared. Crayons appeared from somewhere, along with a coloring page of the city skyline that Marcus immediately attacked with great enthusiasm. Owen shook Caroline's hand when his father introduced them, and said it was nice to meet her in a way that sounded like he meant it, which did something unexpected to her heart. "My dad said you build buildings," Marcus said. "Do you build skyscrapers?" "Because I want to build a skyscraper someday. Except it should have a water slide inside it." Cooper looked at her for a long, assessing moment, then held out the piece of bread he'd just been given, an offering, or perhaps a test. She took a small piece. He seemed satisfied. The dinner unfolded slowly, the way good evenings do, without hurry or agenda. Daniel told her about his firm, about the particular satisfaction of designing structures that had to be both strong and invisible, the way all the best engineering was. She asked questions that showed she understood the work, and he found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't expected, talking not to impress her but simply because the conversation was easy, the way it is with people who know how to listen. She told him about starting her company at 28 with 12 employees and a business plan her father had gone over line by line at the kitchen table in Cincinnati. About the early years of wondering constantly whether she was making the right decisions, and how she'd learned, eventually, that the wondering itself was a sign you were taking the work seriously enough to deserve it. Owen asked how you know if a building will stay standing. You calculate every force that might act against it, she said, and then you build it to bear more than you can calculate. And then you trust the work. Owen thought about this seriously and nodded in a way that suggested he understood she wasn't only talking about buildings. Marcus showed her his colored skyline. She told him honestly that he had a real eye for color, and he beamed in a way that lit up the whole table. Cooper fell asleep somewhere between the main course and dessert, his dark curls pressed against Daniel's shoulder, one small fist loosely curled around his father's lapel. Daniel shifted to hold him more comfortably without breaking stride in what he was saying, the practiced ease of a parent who's learned to do everything with one arm. Caroline watched him without meaning to. Watched the easy way he held the sleeping child, the small automatic adjustment of his posture, the way he kept talking about something he'd read about bridges while managing a sleeping 3-year-old with the same calm competence she'd spent decades trying to project in conference rooms. There is so much kindness in ordinary things, she thought, if you remember to look. After dessert, after Owen had finished the book he'd quietly produced sometime mid-evening, after Marcus had colored 2 more pages and told a story about school that made both adults laugh with genuine surprise, after Cooper had woken briefly and gone back to sleep without protest, the conversation found the deeper water. Not dramatically, not with any single turning point. Just the way conversations do, late in an evening, when the food is gone and the room is quieter and 2 people have spent enough time together to stop performing and start simply speaking. She told him about the 4 years since her last relationship. He told her about the 2.5 years since Ellen. They didn't rush it, didn't make it smaller than it was or larger. They just named it, honestly, without performance, and let it sit on the table between them alongside the empty dessert plates and the candlelight. Do you think, Daniel said after a pause, that it gets easier? Or do you just get better at carrying it? She was quiet for a moment. Both, she said. I think both. And sometimes neither. And then both again. He looked at her. That is an extraordinarily honest answer. I find I have less patience for the other kind. They left Harlow's at 9:30. Gerald brought the check and refused to hear anything about the fact that 3 unexpected guests had occupied the table for 3 hours. He said only that it had been a pleasure, and he said it like he meant it. Owen carried Cooper's jacket. Marcus said goodbye to Gerald, to the piano player, and to 2 other tables that had made the mistake of smiling at him over the course of the evening. On the sidewalk outside, in October air that smelled of leaves and city and something that might have been rain still a few hours off, they stood for a moment in the natural, awkward grace of an ending. I owe you an apology, Daniel said. This was not the evening I promised. No, Caroline said. It was better. He looked at her. Behind him she could see the boys, Owen with his hands in his pockets, Marcus turning slow circles on the sidewalk, Cooper still asleep against his father's shoulder with the absolute bonelessness of a sleeping child. I hope, Daniel said carefully, that we might do it again. Maybe with slightly better logistical planning. I would like that, she said. With or without the boys? There was something careful in how he asked, not really about logistics at all, but about something deeper. About whether she saw what she was looking at. About whether the whole picture was something she was prepared for. She considered it for a moment. She said. If that's all right. I liked them. Something passed across Daniel's face, relief, maybe, or recognition. The look of a man who'd been carefully carrying something heavy for a long time and had just, briefly, been offered a hand. They liked you too, he said. Even Cooper. That bread thing was significant. He doesn't share bread with just anyone. She laughed, a real laugh, not polished or performed, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded. I'm honored. What came after? She walked home that evening, even though her apartment was 12 blocks away and the October air had a chill in it. She needed the walking, needed its rhythm, the way it let her thoughts settle into something she could see clearly. She thought about what it meant to come to a thing late, to arrive at 51 at a table she hadn't expected, with a man she hadn't planned for, and 3 small boys who'd rearranged the evening completely and somehow made it better. She thought about how much of life was like that, how the things you planned for were often just the scaffolding, and the real structure was built from the things you never saw coming. She thought about her father at the kitchen table in Cincinnati, going over the business plan line by line, his reading glasses low on his nose, her mother moving in the kitchen behind them. How certain she'd been at 28 that she knew what she was building and why. She had been right, and she had been wrong, in all the ways that mattered and none of the ways she'd expected. She thought about Owen's question, and her own answer. You calculate every force that might act against it, and then you build it to bear more than you can calculate. And then you trust the work. She'd said it about engineering, about structures and stress and load-bearing design. But walking home through the October streets, she heard it differently. She heard it, she suspected, the way Owen had heard it. As something else entirely. They had coffee the following Saturday. Daniel brought Owen and Marcus. Cooper stayed with Mrs. Bauer, who had recovered from her cold and reported that he'd been perfectly well behaved except for an incident with the crackers, which she described only as an incident and declined to elaborate. The coffee became lunch. Lunch became a walk along the river, where Marcus threw leaves into the water and Owen pointed out that the suspension bridge they were standing under was, technically, an engineering marvel that most people crossed every day without thinking about it. Caroline told him he was right. She told him about the first time she'd stood inside an unfinished building, before the walls went up, when it was still just steel and air, and how she'd understood for the first time that you can't see the real strength of a thing from the outside. Owen filed this away in whatever careful interior library he kept. On the walk back to the parking garage, Marcus took Caroline's hand without ceremony. A dog had startled him, and grabbing the nearest adult's hand was the reasonable response, and then simply kept holding it, because he'd forgotten to let go. She didn't let go either. 6 months later. On a Thursday evening in April, Caroline Whitfield sat at her kitchen table helping Owen with a science project on structural load. Their model bridge, made of popsicle sticks, had so far held 11 textbooks before flexing dangerously, which Owen considered both a success and a challenge still to be improved on. In the next room, Marcus was explaining something at considerable volume and speed to Daniel, who listened with the patient expression of a man who'd learned that the important thing was not to follow every detail, but simply to be present for the telling. From somewhere in the apartment came the sound of small feet on hardwood, and then Cooper appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a cracker. He looked at Caroline. He held out the cracker. She took a piece. He seemed satisfied, and turned and walked back out. From the other room, his brothers' voices continued, overlapping and warm. Caroline looked at Owen. Owen looked at the bridge. "Do you think it'll hold 12? He asked. "Only one way to find out," she said. He smiled, that careful, interior smile of a boy who had inherited his father's steadiness, and his own particular gift for seeing the inside of things. She reached for another toast. Outside the window, the April evening was warm and slow, and the city went on doing what it always did, full of people who hadn't planned for the things that changed them most. Full of tables set for a certain number that ended up seating more. Full of hands extended in unexpected directions. Full of small, ordinary kindnesses that weren't small at all. Full, as it had always been, of people learning, one careful evening at a time, how to begin again.